So first, we're going to go into an introduction on, what exactly a variable is. Some of you may already be aware, but we're going to talk about the specifics within TestComplete. Once we're done with that, we'll move into initializing variables, some of the details associated with that as well. Furthermore, the third topic will be manipulating variables. And then finally, we're going to wrap everything up with some of the use cases regarding variables within TestComplete.
Yeah, we're going to be moving through all of this. That's what an agenda is. I'm just going to encourage you at this point, that if you have questions as this rolls along and you want to know more, please throw those right into the question box. I am going to be monitoring that in addition to contributing to today's discussion. So if you've got any burning questions or anything you're curious about, just throw that right in there and we'll try to address as many as we can.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what a variable is. So I have a nice, shiny, brand new function right within TestComplete, ready to go. So what is a variable? So a variable is essentially a container. Now, it can be completely empty, just like a container can be in real life, or it can contain something. That's the general idea behind a variable. So specifically within TestComplete, it can be something as simple as just a hard-coded string. Maybe you want to just log something in your test log, or perhaps you want to store an on-screen value. Both of those, and there are several other instances of where you can use a variable, but that's just two examples of one.
Yeah, and again, at a high level, and this is somewhat reiterating what Ian has said, a variable is a container within our scripts, within our keyword tests. You can use that variable to contain all kinds of stuff, important information such as text and numbers, or more advanced and more abstract things, like an entire object within your user interface, just as a few examples.
Awesome. Yeah, so that essentially at a high level is what a variable is. So let's take a look at a few ways that we can set our variables. So first, since we're already in the code editor, let's start with that. So some of you may be familiar with this environment from our previous webinar, the 201. So in here, we can easily set a variable. So maybe it's just something like var variable. So I could just keep it like that with no value, like we were talking about when we were describing what a variable is. It can contain nothing, or we could give it a specific value.
And this act of creating a variable, this is known as initializing a variable. Now, there's a couple of pieces going on in the syntax, and we're not going to spend too much time on the specifics here, but something of note, that line starts with var. That tells our program, that tells TestComplete that what comes next is the name of the variable we're going to be creating. Then, as you can see here, we're using the equal sign to tell TestComplete, or our programmer, what we want to put within that variable. And here we're putting in a string, the text that says variable.
Yeah, so pretty basic example there. So that's one way to set a variable. Alternatively, if you come from a background of where you're primarily using keyword tests, you have that functionality available within there as well. So I'm just going to briefly go through that. So let's create a new keyword test. We'll give it the same name. What is a variable?
It's worth noting, while Ian is building this out here, there's a common theme within TestComplete, and that's that the vast majority of what you do within it can be accessed. And this is regardless of whether you're taking a keyword test-based approach using the user interface or going in and crunching out those lines of code in the editor.
Yeah, 100%. So now that I'm in my keyword test, first I need to create a variable.
You'll notice what Ian just did there. In the little bottom portion, we've got a couple of tabs telling us what we're looking at within the workspace. He flipped it around really quickly. He hopped from the test steps section, which houses all the steps in our test, over to the variables pane, which is where all the variables associated with this keyword test live.
Yeah, so what we're going to do next is we're just going to create a variable within this keyword test. So I can simply just right-click in this white space here and choose new item. So by default, TestComplete has populated a variable for me. maybe I want to change the name. Let's just call this test or something like that. Then this speaks to what we were pointing out within the code editor. You can actually choose the data type within here. So maybe instead of a string, I want to use an integer, or maybe one of these other options.
It's worth noting that you should make this choice with care. In the majority of cases, it's going to be somewhat tricky to store something in the variable that it isn't expecting. So, for instance, this variable is currently set to be an integer variable. It means it holds a number. If we turn around and try to push text into it, like a string or something similar, it's going to complain to us and not be very happy. We want to make sure that we're aligning these. Yes, not very happy, as diagrammed on screen.
All right, so now we have a variable. Now within our test, by default, TestComplete is going to use this default value here. However, maybe we want to set a different value during runtime. We can do that within our keyword test by using this set variable value command.
It's worth noting here, that default value, so that is what the variable is going to be initialized to by default. There's that word again. This is what it's going to be set to at the very beginning of our test, and it's going to stay that way until we tell it otherwise, which is what we're looking at here. A different way to tell that variable what it should hold.
Yeah, exactly. So perhaps, at a certain point in our test, we want to change the integer from 0 to 55. That's exactly what this command right here is going to do.
Yeah, you can get pretty creative with this as well. This is a very straightforward thing we just did. We put a line in our program, or excuse me, a line in our keyword test telling that variable to assume the value of 55. However, you'll note that there's all kinds of neat things we can do here. I don't want to give too much away. We're going to be getting into this later, but you'll notice some specific things like on-screen object and object property. This lets you unlock some of the more advanced bits of functionality available within the testing tool, TestComplete. But as I said, we're going to save that for a little bit later.
All right. So let's jump back into the code editor really quick. And I just want to reiterate on setting the variable value at runtime, because we looked at it here in the keyword test, but briefly, again, I just want to point out in the code editor, we can easily reset the value of this variable in the same fashion we just did in the keyword test. So it's as simple as that. It's now reset.
Here's something really quickly, and this is actually answering a question our friend John asked of us. He's noted that, hey, in some scripting languages, for instance, VB script, we actually don't need to declare a type for the variable. It'll just take whatever we give it. And that's actually true for some of the scripting languages within TestComplete. We're showing this here as a form of best practice. We've got a bunch of bits of documentation that lists the specifics of the different languages, because there are some of them that don't require this level of attention to detail. I'd keep that in the back of your head, but it's also important to note that you're not going to get into trouble by declaring them this way, at least if you're using JavaScript.
All right. So we've essentially covered topics 2 and 3, setting variables, as well as manipulating them. So let's go into some of the use cases in which we can use our variables. So for instance, let's start with storing a value for use later. So maybe we have a value on screen that we want to save within a variable, and then maybe log it to our test log or something along those lines. So I'm just going to open up a pretty basic application here. So TestComplete actually comes with a couple of sample applications, which is one of the ones I'll be opening currently. It's a pretty basic orders application. It's based in C#. There's a couple of other examples of it, but I'll be using the C# version. Okay, so here it is on screen here. Now, what we can do in here is we can create some orders. So maybe I want to store the value within an order or something along those lines. So that can easily be done. Let's pretend for a second that I've already created a test and maybe I'm in the process of editing it currently. So maybe I created a test where I'm creating an order. Perhaps Homer Simpson is purchasing something. I believe this is his address. So now maybe I want to store this variable value right here in the total field and use it later on. So what I can do is within my code editor, for example, and this can be done in a keyword test as well, I could just grab my object SPY and target that object that I want to interact with. In this case, I'm going with the total field. So this demonstrates, how easy it is to interact with the objects in your interface within the code editor. So with our handy object SPY, we've grabbed that object, and now we can just reference it directly in our code, or our script rather.
That's a very useful little tidbit we just saw there. We hopped in and we used the object SPY to get the name of these different objects as we need them. This is a major time saver here. Do not bang your head against the table hopping into the object browser or hopping into the name mapping to try to figure out what it is you're working with. The object SPY is built for exactly what we just did, getting quick information about an object we pointed to.
Yeah, so now what I have up on screen, so I have a little code completion window here. So what I can do is I can actually access some of the properties of that object. So right now I'm actually storing an object property within my variable. So I know ahead of time which property this is going to be contained in, or that $100 property is going to be contained in. So I can just access that right away. Alternatively, we could look through it within the object SPY.
So again, we use the object SPY to figure out what's the name of the object we want to work with. And then we use the object SPY to figure out exactly which property we needed. Now, we jumped right to the end there. We know what property we need because we've been doing this for a while. But if you're unsure what property you need, let's say in this case, you need the property that holds 100, but you're just not positive what it is, you can use the search functionality within the object SPY to figure out exactly which property you need that holds that value.
Yeah, exactly. So there we have it. We have our variable value that we have set. Now, maybe just as an example, maybe at the end of my test, I just want to print that variable value. So we don't even have to have it on screen because we've contained it within our variable. So let's just go ahead and print that. And then I'll just run my script. So you can see what exactly was going on there.
Exactly so.
Also, to further demonstrate it, let's just show the variable value changing. So I'm going to log variable twice. Once after I've set it to be this string value right here, variable, and then once after I've set it to be the text of our total object.
So he's going to go ahead and run this script. We're going to get a look at that. Now, here's something interesting going on. We've got a question from our friend Talha out in the chat box. They're asking, so what's the difference between the name mapping object and the aliases object? Now, this is a little bit of a heavy topic, but let me break it down as simply as I can. So what Ian's going to do here is he's going to open up the name mapping for us, and you'll see that there's two different panes open here. Ian's going to go ahead and he's going to highlight the mapped objects pane, and then he's going to highlight the aliases pane. So that top pane, that mapped objects pane, that is the literal hierarchy within your application. This is every single object present within it, every object you've interacted with. Now, the aliases pane is another way of addressing objects. It's a shorter version. I don't want to get too in the weeds on this because, to be quite frank, we could do our own 30-minute webinar just on the name mapping. But the easiest explanation is that the aliases objects we use are still referencing the name mapping. They're just a quicker way of addressing these objects.
Yeah, exactly. And just to piggyback a little bit on what Nick had said about our mapped objects and aliases, um, the aliases, you can think of it as a reference to the mapped object.
Yeah, and our friend Chris asked, so we can just directly address it using the full name every time, right? And I already threw this in the chat, but the answer to that is yes. You can absolutely address it by its full name every time. The alias is just there as a little bit of extra convenience if you've got a really deep hierarchy and you don't want to type all that out all the time.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's just go over what we did really quickly in this script, and then Ramya has a question as well, so we'll address that. So yeah, like I'd mentioned within our script, again, pretty high level here, but I just wanted to show you how you can go about setting the variable value, and really displaying that transition there. But yeah, let's touch on Ramya's question.
All right. So Ramya does have a question here, and they're asking if we could set a variable value through their Jenkins instance, because they're trying to run the same keyword test in multiple environments, and they want to get a little bit of parameterization going on there. Now, for those of you who are confused by all those strange things that we just said, I would not worry about it too much. They're asking a question specific to a continuous integration solution they are using. Now, the short answer to that question is that you cannot instantiate variables through Jenkins itself. You can't specify those there. However, you can absolutely create a helper script or use some of the other neat scripting methods we have to modify how the test executes depending upon the environment it is in. I don't want to get too further into the weeds than that, but I will say if that's an added question, or excuse me, if that's a more burning question and you need some real assistance on it, absolutely shoot an email over to Greer. She's got her email out floating around in the chat, and if you send those to her, then I'll be able to answer that question in a little bit.
Awesome. Yeah. So I just wanted to briefly touch on that question. So within your keyword test, I'm not sure if you were aware of this, but you can actually pass parameters into them. But yeah, we could definitely go into that a little further if you want to. If you want further clarification, just reach out to us.
The shortest version of that answer, and I'm sorry we're taking so much time in this, but the shortest version of that answer is that, can you parameterize? Absolutely. Can I set that parameter through Jenkins? Not so much. You need to find another way. So there's something else neat going on here, actually, and I want to highlight that. Ian, if you could hop back into that script where we set those variable values. So this harkens back to something we were talking about earlier. So we set that variable to hold text, hold a string, which is what you see there. But then we passed in what should have been an integer into it as well when we assigned it to that object's property on line 4. So this speaks back to the question we were asked earlier. Can't you just hand it whatever it needs to be handed? Can it flip that? And the short answer to that is yes. You aren't always strictly bound to the type of variable you created. And this is one example of that.
Awesome. Yeah. So we've looked pretty extensively at how we can set our variables within the code editor. So I just want to briefly draw the distinction between creating a project variable, a project suite variable, and a keyword test variable. So since we already started with the keyword test, let's go from the bottom up. So we created our variable within a keyword test, but keep in mind, this can't be shared across tests. It can only be used locally within this keyword test. Now, maybe if we want to share our variable value across keyword tests or scripts, we could easily save it at the project level or instantiate it at the project level. So if I open up my project by just double clicking on it, I can create a variable in a similar fashion to how I did in my keyword test. However, you'll notice there's two different options here. So we have our temporary variables as well as persistent variables. Nick, do you want to take a second and just give us an explanation on the distinction between those two?
Yeah, what is going on here? We've got temporary, we've got persistent. What's the difference? All right, well, I'll let you know. So temporary variables aren't going to live when the project isn't active. So let's take a step back and let's talk about that really quickly. Within TestComplete, we follow a pretty specific organizational structure with regards to the scripts you create and the things you do within the tool. So the very smallest unit of testing, so to speak, the most specific thing you can get at within TestComplete is going to be either your keyword tests or your scripts. And those are exactly identical to the keyword tests and scripts we've been looking at today. Moving up a level, keywords and scripts belong to a project. Projects house a name mapping. They house pretty much everything you might need to be successful within the tool. And everything Ian is hovering his mouse over now all belongs to the same project. That said, projects are not the biggest item within TestComplete. We also have project suites at the very highest level. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit about how this relates to our specific variables and passing information. But for now, all you need to know is that the only difference between your temporary variables and your persistent variables is that those persistent variables are going to remember their information, even when the project isn't being used. So, for instance, Ian can highlight this, but the first persistent variable we have is variable test. Its type is string, and let's go ahead and give it a default value in there. Let's just assign it to maybe test or some such. Okay. So that persistent variable's value is test. And when we turn it on or we use it for the first time, it's going to hold that value. But let's say that at the end of one of our scripts, we change that value. We mutate it in one of the ways we've seen. Well, because this is set to be a persistent variable, it's going to remember that its value was changed. So if you need to use it later, even if you're not in that project, it's going to remember what you left it as. Temporary variables do not do that. They're only alive in memory as long as the project is in use. So temporary variables are excellent if you know you don't need to pass that information around outside of the project.
Awesome. Yeah, just to add on to that, regarding the local value, typically what people use that for is maybe you're creating accounts within an application. It's particularly useful if you want to iterate or increment with an account name. So maybe like test 1, test 2, test 3. In that case, within your test, whether it's a keyword test or your script, you could easily tell TestComplete, okay, take my persistent variable, in this case test, and add 1 to it. So that's a typical use case for the persistent variable. Okay, so we looked at it at our variables within the project. So let's go up one more level. So like Nick had mentioned, we have our project suite, which holds multiple projects. So within there, again, we can either set temporary and persistent variables. So this would be, or the situation you would use this in is if you want to pass variable values across projects. So again, just to reiterate, in the project would be across tests within that particular project. In the project suite would be across projects. All right. Also, so there's one more way we can pass variables, and that'd be through our distributed testing functionality called the network suite. So let's open up our network suite here. So within the network suite, we can do a similar thing. The only difference is it allows us to pass variables across different nodes. So maybe you have a network suite set up and you're testing on multiple different hosts or multiple different computers, and you want to pass variable values across them. So it's a pretty interesting piece of functionality there. I believe someone had asked that in the questions box.
Yeah. Again, network suites in combination with our variables are enormously powerful things. And I apologize if this is just reiterating what Ian had already mentioned, but when you have your tests running on all of these different machines, when you're distributing them out and doing all this kind of work, there's absolutely going to be situations where information on machine A is going to be needed to successfully test on machine B. And these special little variables we've got within our network suite are the way we're going to pass this information, because they're going to be available across all of these different machines while the tests are executing. Now, I don't want to get too out of scope here, but to make that work properly, you're likely going to want to set up sync points as well, to have your tests pause so they don't get ahead of each other, so to speak. Again, that's a topic for another time, but I do want to highlight just how powerful it can get when you start leveraging variables in combination with what you're already doing within the tool.
All right. So it looks like there's a few questions, and we have covered a lot of material. So let's just pause for 1 second and take a look at some of the questions. All right. So Kunal Malik had asked, how can we get property name if it is inside an object? Sure. Yeah. So what you can do is similar to what I did in my script. You just need to refer directly to the property of which you want to extract the value.
Yeah. And if you're perhaps referring to the fact that it's living within an object that belongs to what your object's spying, you can drill down from within the object spy to the exact object you need.
Yeah, so I'll just go through that one more time. So let's say, let's go with a different example here. Let's say we want to know what lives in the customer name field, or what text rather. So I could just capture that field, just like I did with the total field. And even if I don't know the property name, I could just search for what's currently in that field and get the property name. That way, in each subsequent run, we could still extract that value. So maybe we're using a data loop and we're putting in multiple orders here. We could extract that customer name from each iteration and log it to the test log, or use it later in the test, or there's a bunch of different things we can do there. All right. I think there were a couple other questions.
Yeah, I can tackle Chris Needham's question here. Mm-hmm. So is that sync point we're talking about, is that similar to a rendezvous in Load Runner? And you're absolutely correct. It is entirely similar. In fact, it's nigh on identical. All right. So moving on from that one, our friend Juan has a question about how do we refer to different variables in a script? For instance, we've got a project suite variable versus a project variable. Can they have the same variable name? And first off, exceptional question. I love that. And the answer is yes. So what Ian's going to do here is he's highlighting that we've got this persistent variable with the name test. And we've also got a project suite variable with the name test as well, which we're going to build. Once we're done filling these out, we're going to hop into a script itself, and we're going to show you how we address these two different variables.
All right, so I'm just creating a function called variables. So yes, they can have the same name because they're referred to in separate objects. So for instance, the project variables live in the project object. So there I can see, I can access the variables collection, and within that, the specific variable. So we have our test variable there. Maybe I want to log that variable value. We could even store this project value or project variable within a code editor native variable just to make it a little easier. So maybe we want to call this variable. That way I don't have to type out that whole path there essentially. All right. So that's our project variable, and then we have our project suite variable, which is contained in the project suite object.
Yeah, so here's your answer. The way we access these variables from different items is different. So you can have them be the same name because, as we can see on line 9 there, we're pulling the project variable by calling project.variables.test, whereas our project suite variable is accessed by calling project suite.variables.test. All right, so moving right along here, we've got another good question from our friend Bill. So Bill has a number of different URLs they're working with. They use different environments, and they need to make sure that they can access all of these different environments easily. Now, he's noting that even though we have all these different URLs, the only real difference is the beginning of the URL. So maybe they have environment.website.com or production.website.com. Bill wants to know if we can keep just the beginning of that part as a variable and then use that variable as the basis to build out a bigger URL in our tests. The answer to that is absolutely yes. And I don't know if Ian's going to be able to sketch something like that out for you really quickly. He's going to do his darndest, though. Let's see how he does. Bless his heart. But what he's essentially doing is he's going to create a variable that just holds the part of our URL that's going to change. And then he's going to have a constant, which is not going to be modified, that holds the rest of the URL. Now, you can build it out like I just described with two variables, and one of the variables doesn't change, but you can also use some nifty appending to say, all right, we're going to add the value in our environment variable to qa.domain.com to build our final URL. All of those are possible. So short answer to Bill is you can absolutely do that, and there's a couple of different ways to skin the cat.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just built out a really simple example. So what we're doing is we're passing the portion of the URL that's changing in as a parameter. I just instantiated it within the function as a blank string, essentially. So now when we call this function, so maybe I want to create a separate function. Let's call this call URL. So now I can say build URL. So I'm calling that function, and then I'm going to pass that string that's changing in my domain. So then also, I forgot one thing. Within this function, I would need to concatenate both of them.
Yeah, and concatenate's just our fancy talk of saying we need to take two different strings and put them together to make one big string. Just like addition when you was in middle school or elementary, whenever you learned addition.
Yeah,
I didn't learn it until high school. I don't know.
So we'll just call this big string. And we're going to say, okay, that equals string URL plus constant. And it's as simple as that. So once I go into my separate function where I'm calling my build URL function, it's going to basically put both of those together. So I'm going to pass that string in. So let's just call this environment. All right. So then we could just say log big string.
Let's see if this works.
No pressure.
Oh, there's always an element of uncertainty when you're coding live, even if it's as straightforward as this.
All right. Let's actually.
Yeah, well, he's doing a little bit of workshopping here. Let me answer another question while he gets his house in order. All right. So our friend Abdus has a question about, all right, so relating to what we were talking about earlier, my object hierarchy is too long. How am I going to address this? I don't want to type out a 50, 70, 100 character long object every time. Well, that circles right back around to what we were talking about with aliases and using those to shorten things up. Now, when we're done with this, which I think we're going to give a couple more seconds to, and then take it offline and admit glorious defeat. But the answer to that is we can use aliases to shorten these things up. So you don't need to address it by its whole name, using every object in the hierarchy. So we'll circle back around to that in just a few seconds.
Yeah, so essentially what I'm doing is just to describe it a little bit. So I'm storing it in a project variable, so then we could pass it into this function.
We took the long way. It's all right.
Yep. All right. So I'm going to pass in our test variable, and there we go. Okay, so maybe I need to make a few more tweaks to that, but that's fine.
Yeah. The general idea is that you can follow that pattern of keeping part of a string constant between runs and just changing the variable part and then adding it together when you need them to all come together.
All right. So let's see if we have any other questions.
We're gonna swing back around to Obdus and we're gonna hop into the name mapping and take a look at that aliases pane.
Yeah, absolutely.
So flipping back around to the name mapping. So let's see if we can get a decent example of this. So Obdus's question was, how do I shorten the name of objects that I address? Ian's going to go ahead and explain this really briefly while I answer another question in our chat.
Yeah, sure. So so what you can do with your aliases is you can just change the names of them. And if you're referring to it in a script, maybe you want to make it even shorter. So if we're dealing with an alias in here, by default, we have to use this full path to the object, if you will. But maybe if you're working within a script, you want to make that shorter. I'll just put it in the same function here. So I could just store it within either a project variable or within a variable local to the code editor. So we'll just call this one var variable again. And that way, you know, you don't have to type this out every single time or, you know, copy and paste it. You could just refer back to that variable that you had stored it in. All right. Let's see. It looks like we have a couple other questions as well. Thomas Speth had asked, I'm having a problem with my recorded keyword tests. After installation of new version of a desktop app, all my tests are crashing. Okay, it looks like that may be a little more involved. So I would definitely recommend to just shoot us an email. Let us know exactly what's going on. And we could set up a session to take a look at the particular issues you're running into. Nick Wall had asked, is there a video recording of this available? And yes, absolutely. I believe if I'm not mistaken, you'll receive an email with it contained in there.
Yes, that is absolutely accurate. For all those who are thinking, wow, this is just an amazing session, I'd love to be able to watch this later. You will get an email with a link to this recording within 24 hours after this occurs. That's a little bit out of our hands. It's due to the screen share software we use, but rest assured it will be on its way.
Absolutely.
Right. So here's another question for us. So Ian, can we store and retrieve information from external databases?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Yes, absolutely we can. So there's a few ways we can do that, but essentially what that comes down to is basically using a driver to go out to that database and you know, extract that data. So I actually have an example of that. Just bear with me 1 second here. So perhaps while I'm searching for this, Nick, do you want to talk about that a little more at a high level?
Yeah, absolutely. So TestComplete doesn't use any backing up. So the things we use to communicate with external databases are called drivers. So we don't use any proprietary drivers. We use the same drivers as everybody else. So for instance, the DDT driver is enormously popular as a way of connecting to databases, just as an example. So you can use TestComplete to connect to these databases and store and retrieve information, and you can actually do it in a couple different ways. What Ian is scrolling through right now is an example of using the ADO driver to connect to a Microsoft Jet database. So as you can see, we can approach this using script like we see here, or alternatively, if you're trying to use, for instance, if you're trying to validate the contents of the databases themselves, we actually have a number of built-in database checkpoints as well, right in there. You can use those to connect to the database and make sure that their tables contain the proper information. Yeah, and that specific question was relating to Oracle databases, and the answer to that is yes, we can work with Oracle databases.
Yeah, so regardless of what type of database it is, this is how you would go about interacting with the database. and extracting the information within it. So this would be through the keyword test. So this is the database table checkpoint you see right here in the operations panel. So also, I want to point out, maybe you've already extracted that data before. It's going to be stored in the DB tables stores object in your Project Explorer panel. So I know that's a mouthful. I'll show you where that lives in just a second. But if you were to retrieve the data for the first time, you would just need to specify where you're storing it in the stores item. So that's just going to be the name you're passing in, and also a connection string. So, that for those of you who may be unaware, that's essentially just letting TestComplete know what type of provider you're using. And also, if you need to pass a username and password in there, you can include that in the connection string as well. So once you're in there, you have a couple of options. So you can either retrieve all of the data in a database table, or you can query specific data. All right, and also just one more thing about that. That would be, you also have the option of containing database table information within a variable as well. So if you were to create a variable, regardless of where it is, currently I'm in a keyword test, you can choose the DB table option. So there's a few ways, as you can see, to access this information. But back to my reference about this stores object, where the database table information would be stored. That's located in your project. So at the very bottom in the DB tables option. So right here at the bottom. All right. So, and my apologies if I just inundated you guys with information, but let's take a couple more minutes to look at some more questions that may have been asked.
Yeah, working with databases can be a rabbit hole in and of itself. And honestly, I think that's actually a pretty good idea for its own 201 or 301 session, just working with databases.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
We'll keep that in the back of our minds. I apologize if that became a bit of a rambling answer. So we're going to go ahead. We're going to see if there's any other good questions here. So our friend Pavel has a question about what's the difference between import functions and adding references to an existing script, like using useUnit. All right, so we're going to start by taking a huge step back here. So for the assembled audience, what Pavel is referring to is the ability to take things you've specified in other scripts, entire functions, and using them elsewhere. Now, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. You can do it by importing functions through the wizard there, or you can use a specific line of script called useUnit. Functionally, these are nigh on identical. They're both going to give you access to the entire library of functions you have imported. If you'd like to chat more about the nitty-gritty specifics, just let us know. But in almost every conceivable use case, they're going to function identically, and it's going to be purely up to you with regards to the approach you take. I will say that importing functions through the user interface is a little bit of a more guided approach than just using useUnit to script it out yourself.
All right. So let's see. I think we have a couple of other questions as well. So let's take a look at those. Jamie Geis had asked, what about Universe Database by Rocket Software? That's a great question. I actually would have to look into that, but it should work without a problem.
Yeah. So we're getting a lot of questions about what kind of databases do we support? Well, what can we work with within TestComplete? So we support every database that uses the ODB2 connectivity standard, which is the Open Database Connectivity Standard. That means pretty much every flavor of SQL out there, TFS, Microsoft's offerings, as well as a few more as well. We do have a link online, a documentation piece, so to speak, that gives you a rundown of all the supported database technologies.
All right. also, there was another one from Abdus Salam. Does TestComplete work with PDF file? If so, can we capture value from PDF and compare? Yeah, so there's actually a specific piece of documentation dedicated to working with PDF files. So just shoot us an email and we could definitely direct you to it. Otherwise, just do a quick Google search, TestComplete PDF file. It will pop right up.
Yeah, so my friend Pavel hopped in there and corrected a mistake I had in one of my answers. So he is accurate. We support ODBC database drivers. I got it confused with the communication port in your car, believe it or not. But the acronym I was searching for is ODBC data drivers.
Awesome. Thank you, Pavel. This next question is from Marvelly Foster. I've noticed that most of the TestComplete examples are code base. Can you do more examples using the GUI and show how the code base versus the GUI differs? Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely take that into consideration, Marvelly. We appreciate the feedback. All right. Here's another one from Carl's. Is TestComplete able to extract data from Cosmos DB? Yeah, so for that, I would ask you to refer to our previous answer. So if it's using the ODBC driver, then yes, absolutely. All right, and it looks like someone's currently raising their hand. If you have a question, feel free to drop it right in the Q&A box. All right, so let's just pause for 1 second.
Yeah, and just by the by, folks, we're kind of segueing gently into the Q&A session of today's, session. We have about 7 minutes left on the clock here today, so if you've got any last-minute burning questions, feel free to throw them out there. Now, real quickly, there's a couple of individuals in the chat who had just excellent questions that, for one reason or another, we couldn't address today. Either they were out of scope, either they were a little too heavy for us to tackle live in real time. Whatever the reason, if you have a question that doesn't get answered and you want to know more, you should go ahead and reach out to Greer. And Greer's going to put her email in the chat, but that email is greer.cully@smartbear.com. And she will triage any questions you have and send them along to us.
Awesome. So it looks like we have a couple more that just came in. This one's from Troy. When creating a data loop, how can I get a loop to work on the whole test? For example, I start a test, checking if a browser is open. If not, open it, then navigate to URL and run through a test. Sure. So I'll just demonstrate that really briefly.
Yeah, you should be able to build functionality like that out just in the same process you'd use to build a data loop itself. So if we take, and I'm sure Ian's got an idea in mind as to what he shows, but again, the process for creating a data loop, for those who are not aware, just involves highlighting all the steps you want to loop across and then right-clicking and selecting the Make Data Loop option to pop up that data loop creation wizard.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what I'm exemplifying right here. So if you want to loop across the whole test, I just hit Control A, but you can do Shift click. Regardless, once you've selected all the steps, right click and choose Make Data Loop.
Okay, here's another question. So Rafiq wants to know if we can write Selenium tests in TestComplete. And for those of you who aren't aware, Selenium is the preeminent open source web testing framework. It leverages existing scripting languages and web drivers to create really, really powerful tests. So can you write your Selenium tests in TestComplete? And the answer to that is no. However, TestComplete is able to launch Selenium tests you provide to it. So you can still use TestComplete as a test management, test planning tool where you combine the tests you've already made using our keyword or script-based interface and combine it with the Selenium scripts you've already written out.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you wanted to, do what Nick had just described, you first would just need to create the project item, unit testing, and then add in the specific type of framework that you're using. Maybe it's a Ruby unit test. Once you have a test in there, you can just drag it within a keyword test, or you could even refer to it in a script. So it's as simple as that. You just drag and drop it right into your test. All right. Also, so there's another one from Himansu. Can you provide more database-related examples? How do I compare data from a database column and compare it to UI interface? So I believe there is a sample within our TestComplete 12 sample projects. So I would definitely take a look at that. By default, it's located in the public documents under TestComplete 12 samples. So I would definitely look into that.
And just based on this feedback, we're seriously going to talk about having one of these sessions entirely focused on database-based actions, because it seems to be a topic of interest. Moving right along. So Isla, I think I pronounced that incorrectly, apologies, wants to know if we can include SQL queries right within our TestComplete scripts. And the answer to that is yes. You can absolutely build out queries right in our scripting interface, and they will work exactly how you'd expect your SQL queries to work.
Okay, so this one's from Rafiq Ahmed. What's the best practice to run tests across external workstations or servers? Sure. So you have a number of different options in that regard. Specifically within TestComplete, you have access to Network Suite, which allows you to do just that. So we briefly went over Network Suite. Well, we went over the fact that you could pass variables within it. But just to go over a high-level overview of it, you essentially can take TestComplete tests and push them out to external nodes. So I would definitely recommend looking into that, Rafiq.
Yeah, there is really robust support for that within TestComplete. And again, it all lives within that Network Suite portion. Now, to piggyback off a question we got asked earlier, if you're in front of TestComplete right now and you're looking, you might go, well, wait a minute, I don't see Network Suite underneath my project. So here's what you got to do. You'll notice there's a folder labeled Advanced underneath your project. If you right-click on that folder and then go to Add and select New Item, there's going to be a list of all the nifty things you can do within TestComplete. And a lot of them live in that Advanced section. In there, you're going to find our Network Suite item. It's not listed there because, well, Ian's already got it in. But that is a list of all your options.
All right. So it looks like it is the top of the hour here. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to see you again.